You're right. I should have included the rewritten part immediately after the analysis. From now on, I will. Because the rewritten version is a complete replacement for a long section of your script that you can directly use. I'll provide it as a standalone draft. Have you ever wondered if one of McLaren's most fascinating cars wasn't the one that won championships or the one that shattered speed records, but the one almost nobody knew existed? Collectors spend years chasing forgotten prototypes, secret factory projects, experimental race cars. Most of them eventually come to light. Someone uncovers an old photograph, a retired engineer shares a forgotten story, an archive is opened after decades, but every so often, one project stays hidden so completely that even dedicated McLaren enthusiasts barely know it was ever built. And that's exactly what happened. This wasn't a car designed to impress journalists. It wasn't unveiled beneath bright lights, and it certainly wasn't meant to become famous. Instead, it quietly solved engineering problems that would influence McLaren's future before almost disappearing from history. Today, we're uncovering one of McLaren's most overlooked development cars, a machine remembered by very few people, yet one whose purpose was far more important than most ever realized. And once you discover why it existed, you'll understand why McLaren was perfectly happy keeping it out of the spotlight. The secret begins. McLaren has never believed that success comes from repeating yesterday's ideas. Long before today's hypercars dominated headlines, its engineers were constantly asking one question: can we build something better? Not cheaper, not easier, better. That mindset shaped the company from the inside out. Every new project challenged the last one. Could it be lighter? Could it be stronger? Could airflow work more efficiently? Could unnecessary weight disappear? Sometimes those questions led to legendary production cars. Other times, they produced experimental machines the public was never supposed to see. And one of those hidden projects would quietly become one of the company's most intriguing mysteries. But before we reveal the car itself, there's one important thing to understand. At McLaren, some of the most important vehicles were never meant for customers. They were built for answers. Not every great car is meant to be sold. Most people assume every car company follows the same formula: design it, build it, sell it, move on. For companies driven by engineering, reality is very different. Some vehicles exist for one reason only: to answer a question nobody can solve on paper. Would this suspension work? Would this cooling system survive? Would this new aerodynamic idea actually make a difference? Sometimes there was only one way to find out: build the car. Take it onto the track, push it to its limits, learn from every mile, then go back and improve it. Many of these development cars never received glamorous names. Some wore unfinished panels. Others borrowed parts from several different projects at once. They weren't built to attract attention. They were built to collect answers. That philosophy became one of McLaren's greatest competitive advantages, because today's forgotten experiment often became tomorrow's breakthrough. And one particular development car would quietly prove exactly that: a test car that never asked for attention. When most people imagine a prototype, they picture dramatic wings, wild bodywork, or eye-catching camouflage. The reality was often far less dramatic. Some of McLaren's most valuable test cars looked surprisingly ordinary. That was no accident. The less attention they attracted, the easier it was to continue developing them without unwanted interest. Inside the company, appearance meant very little. The numbers mattered. Every vibration, every temperature reading, every lap, every adjustment. Each test answered another question. Each answer pointed engineers towards something better. According to long-discussed accounts from McLaren historians and former insiders, a handful of internal development projects were known only to small engineering teams before quietly fading into company history. One of them stood apart, not because it won races, not because the public celebrated it, but because the people who witnessed it never forgot what it was trying to accomplish. And the decision to keep it hidden would make its story even more remarkable. Why almost nobody saw it. Today, every prototype is photographed within minutes. One blurry image appears online, and the whole world knows. It wasn't like that decades ago. Factory gates stayed closed. Private test facilities stayed private. Development programs were protected with extraordinary care. McLaren understood that even one small engineering breakthrough could give competitors an advantage. So if a project wasn't ready, it remained hidden. Only engineers, test drivers, and a handful of trusted employees knew what they were really looking at. As the years passed, people retired, records disappeared, new projects replaced old ones, and one remarkable development car slowly faded into obscurity until scattered clues began resurfacing through forgotten interviews, old photographs, and memories shared years later. Together, they revealed a fascinating glimpse into how McLaren's biggest innovations were sometimes born far away from the public eye. But understanding the car itself requires understanding the pressure McLaren faced during that era, because the automotive world was changing rapidly and standing still simply wasn't an option. The pressure to stay ahead. Every breakthrough comes with a risk. Keep improving what already works, or gamble on an entirely new idea. McLaren repeatedly chose the harder path. Not every experiment succeeded, but even unsuccessful projects answered valuable questions. That's why development cars mattered so much. They weren't built to become legends. They were built to prevent expensive mistakes before customers ever saw the finished product. And according to long-standing accounts among McLaren historians and enthusiasts, one little-known development car explored ideas that quietly echoed through later McLaren engineering, even though the vehicle itself never became famous. That's what makes this story so compelling. Its greatest achievement wasn't public recognition, it was the influence it left behind. And in the next part, we'll finally trace where this mysterious McLaren project came from, who approved it, why it was built, and the engineering challenge that made it unlike almost anything else McLaren had attempted. Before we continue, if you enjoy uncovering the forgotten stories hidden behind automotive history, you're exactly where you need to be, because we're only beginning to uncover this remarkable mystery. The project takes shape. By the time this forgotten McLaren project finally moved beyond the drawing board, the company had already earned a reputation for refusing to settle. Success was never the finish line. It was the starting point for the next challenge. Every achievement sparked the same uncomfortable question. How do we build something even better? Inside McLaren's engineering department, that question never stopped echoing. Some ideas began as rough sketches pinned to a wall. Others were born after long evenings spent reviewing test data. Many were abandoned before they ever left the workshop. But every now and then, one idea showed just enough promise to deserve something far more expensive than a blueprint. A real car, not a production model, not a concept for motor shows, not a marketing exercise. A machine built for one purpose, to answer questions no one else had answered before. That's exactly what this mysterious project became. It wasn't created because customers demanded it. It wasn't expected to appear in glossy magazine spreads. Its entire job was to uncover solutions hidden beneath thousands of hours of testing, because McLaren's engineers understood something that many people overlook. Sometimes the smallest improvement becomes the difference between an ordinary car and an extraordinary one. One challenge in particular kept returning. How could they remove even more weight without sacrificing the strength that made the car trustworthy at speed? On paper, it sounded simple. Inside the workshop, it became one of the toughest engineering puzzles they faced. Every pound mattered. Ask most enthusiasts what makes a performance car faster, and they'll probably answer with one word: horsepower. More acceleration, more excitement. But experienced engineers often see the problem very differently. The fastest pound is the one you never have to move. Take 20 pounds out of a car, and suddenly the engine works a little less. The brakes work a little less. The suspension has less to control. The tires have less to fight against. Everything benefits. That's why lightweight engineering became one of McLaren's greatest obsessions. Instead of chasing bigger engines alone, the company searched for smarter ways to make the entire car more efficient. That meant exploring unfamiliar materials, different construction methods, new manufacturing techniques. Some ideas looked brilliant until they were tested. Others survived testing, proved too expensive to build. A few were incredibly strong, yet impossible to repair efficiently. Every success revealed another problem. Every failure pointed toward another solution. This prototype became the perfect classroom. No customer was waiting. No sales deadline was approaching. Its purpose wasn't perfection. Its purpose was discovery. If engineers found a weakness during testing, that wasn't bad news. It was exactly why the car existed, because finding a flaw inside the workshop was infinitely better than finding one after a customer drove the finished product home. But reducing weight solved only half the equation. There was another invisible opponent waiting, one that every high-performance manufacturer had to master. The air itself, the invisible force. Air can't be seen, yet it decides almost everything. How stable a car feels through a fast corner, how efficiently the engine stays cool, how much drag slows the vehicle at high speed. Even tiny changes can completely alter the way a car behaves. Engineers sometimes describe airflow as invisible architecture because every surface shapes it, every vent redirects it, every opening changes its path. Most drivers never notice. Engineers notice nothing else. According to long-discussed accounts surrounding this development program, the prototype gave McLaren an opportunity to study how subtle body changes affected cooling, balance, and stability under demanding conditions. Not dramatic redesigns, not giant wings, tiny refinements, measured carefully, tested repeatedly. Sometimes an entire day's work produced only one meaningful result, one small adjustment, one useful answer. Then the process began again. Drive, record the data, return to the workshop, change one detail, repeat. It wasn't glamorous, but that's how genuine engineering progress usually happens. Not through one revolutionary breakthrough, but through hundreds of tiny improvements stacked together over time. And while those answers slowly accumulated, another challenge never stopped following the team. Time. The clock was always ticking. Engineering doesn't wait. Neither do budgets. Every extra week meant more money. Every unexpected setback delayed something else. Every redesign forced difficult decisions. That pressure followed the engineers every single day. Imagine arriving before sunrise, studying yesterday's results, changing components, preparing another round of testing, only to discover a completely different problem by the afternoon. Some days answered important questions, other days created even bigger ones. That's the reality behind nearly every successful performance car. Progress rarely follows a straight line. It's a maze. Solve one problem and two more appear. Yet those impossible puzzles attracted exactly the kind of people McLaren wanted. Because the engineers weren't discouraged by difficult questions. They chased them. And that explains why this little-known development car remained valuable, even if nobody outside the company ever applauded it. Inside the workshop, knowledge itself had become the reward. Eventually, however, there was only so much data the instruments could provide. The final judgment belonged to someone else, the person sitting behind the wheel. When an experiment becomes a blueprint. Here's one of the most interesting truths in automotive history. The cars people remember are not always the ones that changed everything. Sometimes the real turning point is a vehicle almost nobody remembers. Not because it was the fastest, not because it was the prettiest, but because it taught engineers something they could not have learned any other way. That's why forgotten prototypes matter so much. They are not fighting for trophies. They are fighting for knowledge. And knowledge has a strange habit of showing up years later in places nobody expected. By the time McLaren moved on from the secret development project, the car itself was no longer the biggest story. The information it produced was every test, every adjustment, every success, every failure. It all became part of a growing library of engineering experience. Experience that could not be bought. It had to be earned, 1 mile at a time, one mistake at a time, one breakthrough at a time. And that is usually how innovation really works. Not through one magical invention, but through hundreds of small improvements that slowly transform an entire company. Which leads to an even better question. If this prototype quietly influenced future thinking, can we still see traces of it today? The answer is more complicated than most people think. The ideas lived longer than the car. When enthusiasts look back at automotive history, they usually focus on the finished products. Production cars, race winners, limited editions, the famous names. But engineers remember something else. They remember ideas. An idea that worked once can be refined. An idea that failed can still inspire a better solution years later. That's why experimental projects almost never disappear completely. Even if the vehicle itself is gone, its lessons can survive inside the next generation of designs. McLaren built its reputation on lightweight engineering, chassis development, aerodynamic efficiency, and driver-focused performance. But those strengths did not appear overnight. They were shaped over years of testing, years of experimentation, years of asking hard questions. No historian can always draw a perfect straight line from one obscure prototype to one specific production car. But projects like this help strengthen the engineering culture that defined McLaren's future. And that is the important part. The prototype was not valuable only because of what it became. It was valuable because of what it taught. And in engineering, understanding often creates progress long before the public ever notices it. Still, the company's hardest challenge was never just building ideas. It was deciding which ideas deserved to survive. Because not every experiment earns a second chance. Knowing when to walk away. One of the toughest decisions inside any engineering company is admitting something is not ready. That takes discipline. Time has already been spent. Money has already been spent. Hundreds of hours may already be gone. And still, the smartest move can be stopping. Not because the idea was useless, but because the timing was wrong. Technology changes. Materials improve. Manufacturing methods evolve. An idea that seems impossible today can become practical 10 years later. That has happened again and again throughout automotive history. McLaren understood that better than most. Its engineers were not afraid to shelve a project if a better path appeared elsewhere. Because progress is not always about forcing one idea forward. Sometimes it is about knowing which path to leave behind. That mindset protected the company from chasing technology too early. And it helped explain why certain experimental projects quietly disappeared without any fanfare. They had already done their job, even if the public never realized it. Not every legend has a name. Think about the famous cars everyone remembers. People know their names instantly. They know the horsepower, the top speed, the racing wins, the auction prices. But behind every famous machine, there are forgotten vehicles that help make those victories possible. Cars with no celebrity status. Cars that appeared in almost no photographs. Cars whose biggest achievement happened inside engineering reports instead of newspaper headlines. Those machines rarely get documentaries. They do not become posters on garage walls. And yet, without them, some legendary cars might never have reached their full potential. That is why stories like this matter. They remind us that history is not only shaped by winners. Sometimes it is shaped by quiet contributors working completely out of sight. And maybe that is exactly where this mysterious McLaren prototype belongs. Not in the center of the spotlight, but standing quietly behind it, helping build the future while asking for nothing in return. A quick favor before we keep going. If you're enjoying these forgotten automotive stories and you prefer real history over recycled internet myths, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Every week, we uncover incredible cars, engines, prototypes, and engineering stories that most enthusiasts have never heard before. If that is the kind of automotive history you enjoy, you are going to love what comes next. Now, let's get back to the mystery. Because the people connected to this project eventually moved on. Some retired, some joined different programs, some kept helping shape McLaren's future. But the memories they carried would become valuable decades later. The people who kept the story alive. Cars do not tell stories. People do. Every prototype has engineers who designed it, mechanics who assembled it, drivers who tested it, technicians who repaired it. Without those people, history disappears. Over time, fragments of McLaren's development culture began to surface through interviews, technical discussions, enthusiast research, and historical archives, rarely all at once, usually one memory at a time. One engineer remembers a design meeting, another recalls a difficult test session. Someone else remembers seeing an unusual development car tucked away inside a workshop. Each memory is only one puzzle piece. None tells the full story on its own, but together, they reveal something much bigger. They reveal a company where curiosity often mattered more than recognition, where solving engineering problems counted as success, even if nobody outside the building ever heard about it. That is a remarkable way to build automobiles. And it is one reason McLaren earns so much respect across the automotive world. But the biggest lesson from this hidden prototype is not just about carbon fiber, or aerodynamics, or lightweight engineering. It is about something much more universal. And that is exactly where we are headed next. In the next part, we'll explore why forgotten prototypes become more fascinating with time, how collectors and historians keep searching for missing pieces of this mystery, and whether this secret McLaren project may still have surprises left to reveal decades after its final test drive. Why the most important stories are often the hardest to find. The older you get, the more you understand that history is not just about what survived, it is also about what disappeared. Walk through an automotive museum and you will see the legends, perfect restorations, championship winners, rare production cars preserved under spotless lighting. But for every machine that made it into a display case, there are dozens that vanished without a trace. Not because they were worthless, because no one expected them to matter later. Prototype cars were especially vulnerable. Most manufacturers treated them as temporary tools. The testing was the point. Once the job was done, the car had served its purpose. Some were stripped for parts. Some were rebuilt into something else. Some were parked, covered, and slowly forgotten. McLaren was no different. Across the automotive world, experimental cars often live short, private lives. That is why historians spend years trying to rebuild the story of one prototype from fragments. A workshop photo, a handwritten note, a faded interview, a retired engineer remembering one detail from decades ago. One clue means almost nothing by itself, but together, they start to form a picture. And that is exactly how researchers have approached this McLaren mystery. Not with rumor, not with fantasy, with evidence. Because separating fact from legend is much harder than most enthusiasts realize. When legends grow larger than the facts, car people love a mystery, sometimes too much. The moment a forgotten prototype is mentioned, the story starts growing. Someone says it had absurd power. Someone else swears it was impossibly fast. Another person insists only a handful of people ever saw it. Those stories make good conversation, but they are not always true. And that is why this story is more interesting when you leave the exaggeration out of it. The documented truth is already strong enough. McLaren has long used experimental development cars to test ideas before they reach production. That much is clear. What is often harder to prove is exactly how each individual prototype influenced later cars. And that is normal. Development does not move in a straight line. Ideas overlap. Teams change. Projects merge. A lesson from one experiment can end up shaping several future vehicles, not just one. So instead of asking, which famous McLaren did this prototype become? The better question is, what did the engineers learn from building it? Because that is where the real value lived. Not in fame, in education. And those lessons kept shaping McLaren's engineering culture long after the car itself faded from view. The culture that made it possible. Every great car company has a personality. Some chase luxury, some chase raw power, some chase volume. McLaren built its identity around something else. Curiosity came first. If there was a better solution, someone inside the company wanted to find it, even if that meant challenging ideas people had already accepted. That kind of culture takes confidence. It also takes humility. Confidence to explore bold ideas. Humility to admit when something does not work. The secret prototype we have been talking about represents that balance perfectly. It was not important because it shocked the public. It was important because it gave engineers freedom to explore without public pressure. Inside those workshops, failure was not always failure. Sometimes failure was just information. Information that prevented a much bigger mistake later. That lesson reaches far beyond cars. It is how real innovation works in almost every field. Test, learn, improve, repeat. Simple in theory, hard in practice. But that is exactly what separates companies that keep evolving from the ones that simply repeat yesterday's success. The collectors who keep asking questions. One of the most fascinating things about automotive history is that so much of it no longer lives inside factories. It lives in private collections, archives, libraries, old photo albums, personal garages. Dedicated enthusiasts keep searching for forgotten photographs, engineering notes, and factory records that can preserve stories like this one. Some spend years on a single mystery, not because there is money in it, because they care. Every newly discovered photo, every forgotten document, every interview with a retired engineer adds another piece to the puzzle. Sometimes those discoveries confirm what people suspected. Other times, they completely change the story. That is what makes automotive history feel alive. It is not frozen. New evidence keeps appearing. Old assumptions keep getting challenged. And maybe somewhere, inside a box that has not been opened in years, or in an archive nobody has checked since the 1980s, another piece of this prototype story is still waiting to be found. That possibility is what keeps historians searching. Because history is rarely finished. It is only waiting for the next discovery. The real legacy of a hidden car. So what did this secret McLaren prototype actually accomplish? Probably not what most people would expect. It did not become a famous supercar. It did not dominate headlines. It did not sit under the lights at auto shows. Instead, it proved something even more valuable, that progress often happens quietly, away from cameras, away from applause, away from public recognition. The greatest contribution of an experimental car is not always the car itself. Sometimes it is the confidence it gives engineers to keep pushing forward. That kind of legacy cannot be measured by auction prices, or horsepower, or lap records. It is measured by influence, by ideas, by the willingness to keep asking difficult questions. And that spirit has always been part of McLaren. Still, one question remains. After everything we have uncovered, could there still be secrets about this prototype that only a small circle has ever known? The answer may surprise you, because in the final part, we will bring everything together, explore why mysteries like this keep fascinating enthusiasts decades later, and reveal why the forgotten cars often teach us more than the famous ones ever could. And before we are done, you will see why the true story was never really about one hidden prototype at all. One last secret. At the beginning of this video, I asked you to imagine a McLaren prototype that almost nobody ever saw, not because it failed, not because it lacked potential, but because it was never meant to become famous. Now we've reached the end of that journey, and there's one final surprise. This story was never really about finding one forgotten car. It was about discovering how great cars are actually created, not through one flash of genius, not through one perfect blueprint, and certainly not overnight. Real innovation is much quieter than people imagine. It's built one decision at a time, one test session after another, one redesign after the next. Thousands of tiny improvements that, on their own, seem almost insignificant, until one day, they change everything. Long before a new McLaren appears on magazine covers, someone has already spent countless hours inside a workshop asking difficult questions. Engineers, mechanics, designers, development drivers, people whose names most of us will never know. Without them, many of the world's greatest performance cars would never have existed. The prototype succeeded, even if few people remember it. If you judge this mysterious McLaren project by publicity, it disappeared. If you judge it by production numbers, it accomplished very little. But if you judge it by the reason it was built, it was a success. Prototype vehicles are never created to become celebrities. They're built to answer questions. Sometimes those answers lead directly to the next production car. Sometimes they prove an idea simply doesn't work. Both outcomes are equally valuable. Because engineering is not about proving you're always right. It's about discovering the truth before customers ever sit behind the wheel. That philosophy became one of McLaren's greatest strengths. Every lesson learned behind closed doors reduced uncertainty. Every mistake discovered inside the workshop prevented a much larger mistake later. Those victories rarely appear in headlines, but they are often the invisible foundation beneath every legendary performance car, the people history almost forgot. When we think about automotive history, we usually remember the famous names, the legendary drivers, the iconic founders, the championship-winning cars. They deserve that recognition. But today, think about someone else. Think about the engineer who spent weeks solving one tiny problem that nobody outside the factory would ever notice. Think about the mechanic carefully assembling experimental parts by hand. Think about the development driver repeating the same lap again and again and again. Not for applause, not for trophies, simply to collect better information. Those people rarely become household names, yet their fingerprints are everywhere. Every improvement, every refinement, every breakthrough, someone quietly made it possible. And in many cases, almost nobody ever knew who they were. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden inside this prototype story. History is not only written by the stars standing under the spotlight, it's also written by the people working quietly behind it. Why the mystery may never end. One of the most fascinating things about automotive history is that it is never truly complete. A forgotten photograph surfaces, an old engineering document is rediscovered. A retired employee shares a memory that has remained untold for decades. Every discovery answers one question and creates another. That is part of the excitement. Not every mystery needs a perfect ending. Sometimes the missing pieces are exactly what keep the story alive. This secret McLaren prototype may never have a complete public record. Some details may remain uncertain forever. And perhaps that is fitting. It was developed in secrecy. It spent its life away from public attention. Maybe it was always destined to keep part of its story hidden. Not because someone is protecting the truth, but because time quietly erases parts of every story. What survives depends on what people choose to preserve. Thankfully, passionate enthusiasts continue making sure those stories are never completely lost. The bigger lesson. In the end, this was never just the story of one forgotten prototype. It was the story of curiosity, the willingness to question accepted ideas, the courage to experiment when success was anything but guaranteed. That is how engineering moves forward. Not through perfection, through persistence. Every famous McLaren, every legendary sports car, every unforgettable performance machine exists because someone once asked a simple question: what if there's a better way? Most of those first attempts are never celebrated. Many are never even remembered. But without them, the legends we admire today might never have existed. That is why forgotten prototypes matter. They represent possibility, not polished endings, but uncertain beginnings. Because every great automotive achievement starts in exactly the same place: an idea, a sketch, a workshop, and a small group of people determined to build something better. Before you go, if this story surprised you, then here's something worth thinking about. Some of the most influential vehicles in history are the ones almost nobody has ever heard of. They never won championships. They never broke sales records. They simply helped make something greater possible. And that's exactly why they're worth remembering. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of McLaren's history, don't stop here. Watch the forgotten Ford engine everyone wants now. It's another remarkable automotive story that proves today's overlooked machines can become tomorrow's most valuable legends. Once you hear what happened to that forgotten Ford engine, you'll understand why collectors are still chasing it decades later. I'll see you in the next story.